Hi, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend our webinar today. My name is Alex. I'm Leaders National Trainer, and I'll be working with you guys through the training on the Ubiquiti hosted controllers. We're going to take a look at the different options that we have and the way that we can host these controllers. It's a bit of a mixed webinar today, so we're going to look at both the technical setup side of things as well as the commercial reason for doing this. So just as always with any of these webinars, there's a prize draw at the end. You have to have attended in order to be eligible. And in terms of questions, etc., please feel free to ask questions throughout the course of the webinar. We will be answering all the questions towards the end. And if it's left of field and technical, please don't hesitate to ask. We're also going to be sharing off some resources with you guys directly after this presentation as well, which you can use to set up the controllers, etc. yourself. Just a note on the actually, we can skip that. That's fine. We can delve straight into it. So, like I said, please feel free to ask any questions. More than happy to assist. So, just a place to start off with. We can take a look at what we are essentially seeing on a day-to-day basis in terms of the different management centers in Ubiquiti. And I'm starting it here to just explain what we have available in the network controller side of things versus what we have available on something like a UDM or UDR or something like that, one of the Ubiquiti appliances, so a physical appliance that you would have for a customer. So the one that we all know and use on a day-to-day basis is the Ubiquiti network application. So the network application is the primary place where we would typically set up our access points, manage our switching, set up our network environment, etc. This is the primary thing that you will have available when you're choosing to host the controller yourself. So while we're on the topic of hosting the controller, so the controller is free of charge. You can download it from Ubiquiti's website. It works on a variety of different operating systems. It works on Windows, Mac, and even Linux. And we're going to see a couple more options that you have as well. But it's free of charge. Anyone can go download this, and you can choose where you want to set this up. So you can either set this up on your own piece of hardware, or you can set this up on a customer's piece of hardware. We're going to really expand on the capabilities of what the network application can do and what the controller software can do, but really just to understand that this is the primary thing that we get when we're setting up the controller ourselves. The things that we're missing when we're setting up the controller as our own environment is if you buy a dedicated appliance like a UDM or UDR, etc., you have access to protect, talk, access, and connect. And those are the different application centers that you manage cameras, VoIP, access control systems, the Connect displays, etc. So that wouldn't be available in the controller, and I don't see this coming to the controller in the foreseeable future either. So the primary thing that you gain with the controller is the network application. So protect, obviously surveillance, talk, more on the VoIP side of things for Ubiquiti. The access side of things is access control, and connect is the connect displays that are very new to Ubiquiti, and we've just started getting them into Australia as well. The primary place where we would typically see all of the sites that we've set up and all of the controllers that we host would be the portal. So as you can see on screen, essentially you have the different locations. So we've got New York, London, San Francisco, etc. on screen, and these are different physical controllers set up in the customer's premises. Ubiquiti's big focus is actually on more people deploying controllers. So they measure our success and they measure a lot of reseller success in terms of how many controllers are being deployed. That being said, there's still definitely a place for hosted controllers where you host it yourself. And primarily where it comes down to, what it comes down to is what is your business model? So your business model is probably the deciding factor for determining whether you're going to put down a controller or whether you're going to host a controller, and what your different methods of income is for a customer. So the choices we make essentially is, do we want to have either a dedicated piece of hardware that we're putting down at the customer's premises that is a higher upfront cost, Or are we going to charge them a monthly service fee where we host the controller ourselves and we just pass part of that cost back to the customer? So as a good example, we can say that we can either charge the customer, I don't know, $20 a month in order to have access to your controller. Or alternatively, you can go, okay, we can sell you a controller. We have to put it down on site. You have to make sure that there's adequate cooling, et cetera, all the stuff that you would normally see with hosting anything or setting up anything in a ICT space. And then that cost is obviously much higher. So it would be like $1,000+ versus a monthly cost. So this would primarily dictate the way that your customer wants to go forward. I think from our experience and what we've seen interacting with most resellers, is there's obviously a big shift towards including more services with your service offering. So instead of just having a high upfront cost and then it's a sell and forget sale, people are more looking to sell a contract and sell an agreement where you're keeping in touch with that customer on a month-to-month basis. Important here, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can do both. So if you want to, you can sell a monthly contract to some customers and still choose to deploy a controller on other customers. It completely depends on how you want to do it. I just want to make a call out here. So if you have a lot of customers that are at the cost-effective end of the scale, they don't have a lot of money to invest in a controller. Hosting the controller yourself is a very cost-effective way for them to still get Ubiquiti, because it means you can sell them a Ubiquiti access point and a Ubiquiti switch, etc., but they don't have to carry the cost of the controller as well. You just charge them for that monthly. So this plays neatly into where our hardware resides. So specifically referring to the controller in this instance. So is your controller going to be local, hosted on the customer's premises, or is it going to be hosted in your own data center? There's actually 3 tiers here. So either we can set up a controller as a dedicated appliance that just does the Ubiquiti stuff, and that's a UDM or UDR or something like that. Or we can repurpose a customer's equipment. So if they have a server in place already, we can say, okay, we can install the Ubiquiti controller on that. It's a nice low-cost way to get the controller up and running. Or alternatively, you can choose to host this controller in your own data center or in your own server room if you have that space available. So this obviously has an impact on the upfront cost for the customer and the upfront cost for you. It's obviously more expensive for you to set up your own server environment where you're hosting this yourself, and it will take longer to recoup the funds if you're doing that style of deployment. But you're saving the customer some money by reducing the upfront cost. A big consideration here for choosing where you're going to put your hardware also relates to the functionality that you're going to implement on it. If you're looking to introduce radius authentication or guest hotspot portals, I would recommend setting up the controller locally. The primary reason for that is due to latency concerns. If your server is very far away from where the customer is, it might be slow to authenticate radius users or slow to authenticate guest users. So normally I would say that if you have a guest or radius authentication requirement, the controller should be on premise. Also just want to make a note here that when you're buying a controller or choosing to get a controller, it's an important consideration that if you're hosting the controller yourself, you still need to put a appliance down on the customer's side, and that appliance is typically the gateway. So you'll typically need to put down a USG or something similar to that to function as your firewall. Alternatively, the controller will still be able to connect client devices from remote sites as well, if you point it towards your controller through the remote provisioning mechanisms, which we're going to take a look at in a moment. But more often than not, you still want to protect that customer's environment by having a firewall or something in place there. We're going to expand on that in a sec. So taking a quick look at the benefits here. Sorry, I see a quick question coming through that asks, are we going to record the session? Yes, we are absolutely going to record this, and we will share this out to you guys afterwards as well. So just to compare the benefits and the disadvantages of each or the other. I don't think there's too many disadvantages, but in terms of the benefits, so a hosted controller, the The plus side is that it's a lot cheaper for your customer to start, but the setup complexity on your own behalf is much higher because there's a lot more factors to take into account. So we're going to see what it is that you need to set up in a moment. An on-site controller, you typically do the full setup just through your cell phone. IT Tech will do the initial adoption through their cell phone, and that's the entire setup. It's very, very easy to configure. And when we're talking about the network setup here, it's pretty much the same on both sides. The only advantage or the only thing that we need to be aware of is that a hosted controller, you obviously need to have a setup for stun in order to configure the devices and have them adopted remotely. We're going to talk about that more in a second if that doesn't make sense right now. In terms of recurring revenue, hosted controllers definitely have an advantage here because on a month-to-month basis, you're going to send a bill out to the customer. You have that customer, a conversation with that customer every month. It keeps the customer pretty sticky to you for that recurring billing cycle. An on-site controller is typically a little bit more sell and forget. You put it down on the customer's premises. You can still remotely manage that customer's site if you wish, but it is not as sticky as hosting the controller yourself. I'm going to talk about why in a moment. And then in terms of cost, so the upfront cost, this is a little bit debatable, but it's obviously a little bit more expensive to put down a controller for the customer if the customer carries the cost. And the hosting the controller yourself can either be really cost effective or it can be pretty expensive. If you're hosting the controller yourself and you've got to put down a full server, you've got to put it in a data center, etc., then it obviously becomes a little bit more expensive on that side. In terms of stickiness, so keeping the customers to you, I think this is where the biggest selling points comes in for hosting the controller yourself. If you're hosting the controller yourself, the customer's access points, switches, etc., are provisioned and connected to your controller wherever it's hosted. If the customer chooses to move to another provider, that connection is broken. And essentially, the customer will either have to go buy a full new controller to have it on their own site, or the other provider has to set up a controller as well. From our experience, generally customers that start off on hosted controllers seem to stick on hosted controllers, and they tend to stick with the same MSPs as well because of the inherent cost and complexity with moving away from a current provider. The regular controller is also, the on-site controller obviously makes the customer a little bit sticky because you've got this ecosystem as well. So those are very valuable options. So I see a couple of questions or comments here on AWS and Azure as well. So yes, we're going to talk about that in a moment. But essentially, you don't have to host this yourself. You can also set this up in a Azure environment or AWS environment. And we're going to talk about how that's done in a moment as well. So taking a look at the requirements for setting up a local controller. So essentially it can be as small as a little UDR, and all that you need to set this up is the appliance and an internet connection. The UDR is a wonderful little device. It's got a built-in firewall. It's got all of the controller capabilities, etc. It's an excellent way for you to start off with a customer. This has limited scale, so if your customer has a internet connection that's faster than 1 gig, then I wouldn't be going with this. Actually, it's about 700 meg. I wouldn't be going for this. If your customer is more of a larger business or has more people connecting clients, then again, I would rather go for something like UDM Pro or something similar, but this is a viable option. This is easy. So to host the controller on the customer side of things or to set up the controller on the customer side of things is nice and easy. If we want to host this controller ourselves in our own server room, then there's a bit more implications that we need to be aware of. So first thing that we need to be aware of is we need a static external IP address, and that probably goes along with a FQDN as well. You need to have a server available. Important, the server doesn't necessarily just have to be a UniFi server. It can do other stuff as well. I listed 3CX and Microsoft there. Depends on what you want to use that server for. Provided it has enough resources and you allocate it correctly, you can use that server for other stuff. But it can also function as a UniFi controller. You need to set up stuff like a firewall. You need to have power redundancy options. You need to obviously have a building to put this all in. You need to have a rack. You need to have air conditioning. You need to have just a whole bunch of different stuff in order to keep a controller up and running. So this in itself kind of lends itself naturally to rather offloading this cost to something like AWS or Azure, where all this is the cost of this is carried over to someone else, and you're just paying a monthly fee to them. So it depends on which way you want to go. I will just make a note here that the UniFi controller is very lightweight. I would naturally kind of favor setting it up on my own dedicated hardware as opposed to paying a monthly fee for it. Yes, you don't have, or you have a bigger expense in terms of the building, the infrastructure, etc., and the redundancy. But because of how lightweight the application is, you can get started with a couple of low-cost customers nice and easily with this. As you grow, you can scale this and essentially get bigger servers and eventually offload to something like Azure or AWS. So there's also a bit of system specs available from Ubiquiti as well if you want to know what you need to run this on, but it's fairly lightweight, just as a general comment. In terms of adopting devices to a controller that you host yourself, so this is a little bit more of a tedious process. So if the controller is local, it just does local discovery. It will find all the access points and switches locally, and it's nice and easy to provision and connect. If the controller is something that is remote, we need to take an access point or switch or whatever it is and point it to wherever that controller is hosted. One of the ways that this can be done is through something like SSH, where you can just go, I'm going to set a inform URL, and with that inform URL, it points it to wherever my server is hosted. That FQDN or static IP address we were referring to earlier. And essentially, once that device boots up, it will go to that address and become adoptable in that address. This is probably the slowest and worst way to do it. If you have hundreds of access points and switches, it obviously becomes quite tedious. So I'm not recommending that this is the be-all and end-all, but you do get different options as well. So you get DHCP option 43, DNS options, etc., to simplify this process. This is just the easiest way for me to explain it, but essentially we need to point a device to wherever that controller is hosted. I also want to just quickly talk about the primary advantage here of hosting the controller yourself, and that is multi-site management. So you'll see at the top here, I have an option called sites, and with this, I can very easily select which site I want to work on. And important to note that settings on a site is specific to that site only. So if, for example, you set up a Wi-Fi SSID or a network or something like that in Leader's Office Adelaide here in that instance, then those settings are unique to that site. I have a access point set up here, and you'll see this access point, it's got all of its configurations. The SSID that it's currently got on our default site is just called default site Wi-Fi. And if I scan for this in my PC, I'll see that access point picked up. What I can do as well is I can choose to move this access point to another site, and that's directly built into the interface. I can select the site that I want to move it to. And important to note here that as soon as this move completes, the access points will fetch the settings of that site. So the site is basically the primary way that things are configured. The access points itself and the switches, etc., don't necessarily carry the configurations. It's all related to the site. So the Wi-Fi SSID that I have here is Leader Adelaide. It won't show up at first. It will carry the old SSID through until that access point's restarted. I've now restarted it. And as soon as that's done, you'll see it goes offline and online. And as soon as that's done, you'll see in the SSID list, it just appears. So there we go, Leader Adelaide. It's now grabbed the settings from the site. So important to understand this because it relates to your networking setup. So I often get questions around, okay, but can we reuse networks and domains, etc., across multiple sites? And the answer is absolutely yes. You can have, let's say, for example, 10.0.0.1 on the Adelaide site, and you can have the same address range on the default site and whichever site you want. whatever you're configuring into that site, so the switches and networking, etc., it will grab the settings from that and they function independently from each other. But you as the MSP still has the ability to drill down into each one of these sites and configure and make changes to that site. We also have an option to add site admins as well. So I'm on my default site here, and you'll see that I can go onto the system settings and add a new administrator into this. And this administrator is specific to the site. So I can invite new administrators. I can give them different privileges. I can say what they have access to. If I go to a different site here, we'll see that some of the administrator accounts are removed, and it's only the sites or the administrators that I've specifically added into the site that has access to it. So if you're an MSP and you have multiple people looking after different sites, or even an IT person in the customer's site, then you can give them access, and you can very easily revoke access as well. So you maintain overarching control of this customer's environment, but you can add sub-admins and even just viewers. So if you want people to only view stats and stuff like that, it's a very viable option. In terms of the portal, so managing all of this is still done through the unifi.ui.com portal. So you can either access the network server locally if you connect to it directly, or you can list that site through the same place you would see all of your hardware. So you'll see the consoles page there has my dream machines and the traditional stuff that we would normally see in unifi.ui.com, but the networks page, the network server page, lists all of the network servers that I control. So in terms of accessing stuff remotely, you can access your controller remotely as well. Where this is really helpful is if you have multiple controllers that are hosted at each client's site. So let's say, for example, instead of hosting an overarching controller, you have a few controllers set up on multiple customer sites to keep cost down. You can still reach all of those sites through this page as well. So it is nice and flexible in terms of how you can access it. Something that is often overlooked is that the UniFi controller is also available as a Docker image. The benefit with Docker images and Docker in general is that everything is packaged, so you don't have any third-party dependencies, and this is because it's containerized, you can stick it on a ton of different hardware types. So it makes it nice and easy to host. You can even do stuff like put this onto a NAS. If the customer has like a Synology or QNAP or something like that in their environment and it's got enough processing power, you can run this on a NAS if you really want to. And it's nice and flexible. It's a little bit out of scope for this webinar. We don't really have enough time to do a full setup on of a Docker setup, but essentially Ubiquiti has a full community page on this, and it is nice and containerized as well. In terms of hosting this on Azure or AWS or something like that, again, this is very much a community supported method of deployment, and there is a ton of resources for this as well. So you'll see I've got a link at the bottom there, which is a script that someone set up to get the UniFi controller set up on Azure, and it just simplifies the setup and deployment process a lot. The big problem you have with Azure and AWS and most of the hosting platforms is getting the port configurations correct. So sometimes you don't have access to configure the ports the way you want them to. These scripts make it nice and easy for you to essentially just simplify that setup. In terms of the different hardware, so I'm not going to bore you guys with the specs, but just to highlight where we would use the hardware over the software and what the use case is for each of those. So the UDR is essentially perfect for smaller deployments where you have, I would typically say the sweet spot's around 10 to 25 client devices. Your internet connection is about 500 megabit per second, and that's the kind of sweet spot for it. UDM Pro and Pro SE, more aimed towards regular businesses, SMBs. I'd say up to about 250 users odd, and essentially that's if you have a gig connection, you can do a gig connection through this. These are the primary devices that Ubiquiti are continuing to focus on as well. Ubiquiti are looking to introduce a more cost-effective controller at the very bottom end of the scale as well in future, and I'm very excited to see how that's going to look. And we've also got the Dream Wall, which is essentially just a UDM on steroids. It's got a switch added to it and a more powerful processor, etc. Still, I think it has the same limitation in terms of users. It's not a finite limit, but typically the sweet spot's around 250 odd user/client devices. But it can be more, can be less, depending on what you're setting up in terms of security, etc. Ubiquiti does have a calculator online if you want to know how many client devices you can set up on each one of these devices and how many cameras you can connect, etc. So just pay attention to that as well and have a look on the website. It is free of charge. And then this is what I was referring to earlier in terms of an appliance still needed for the customer site. So I know there's a big demand right now for USGs, so Unified Security Gateways. If you're hosting the controller already and you want to put down a security gateway at the customer's premises, the tiny little USG was probably the best way to go. Ubiquiti is looking to introduce a replacement for that. Early days, I don't have the exact details on it yet, but we expect to see a USG replacement coming out shortly. The way to do this right now is essentially you would get a Gateway Pro or UXG Pro, and that essentially is a firewall appliance that you put down for the customer's site, and it just ensures that the customer's site remains safe. There's something on here, two things that I know we get a lot of questions around, and that is the Cloud Key Enterprise and the Cloud Console. So previously I said there's 3 options to host the controller. Actually, there's 4, actually 5, depending on how you want to put it. But so the first way is obviously dedicated appliance. Second way is hosting either the controller on the customer's premises or on your own. And then the third way to host this controller is through Ubiquiti's own hosting. So Ubiquiti actually has a online service available where they host the controller on your behalf. Please note that this is not available in Australia yet. Also, I would probably, from my own perspective, I would prefer to host the controller myself because I have more granular control over this. This cloud console that we're seeing right now is only available in the US. If you try signing up for it, you literally cannot pay for it. It's not available in this region, and also latency will be an issue right now. So for that reason, I typically prefer to host my own thing. And moving forward as well, I'd still probably prefer to host my own thing. The one next to it is the important one, the Cloud Key Enterprise. So if you don't want to go through the expense and complexity of setting up your own server with your own software installed on it, etc., the Cloud Key Enterprise is essentially designed to take that away from you. What it does is it's a normal server. It's a 1RU server. It's got 2 Xeon Gold processors in it. It is a pretty hardcore device. It's extremely capable, and you can do up to 5,000 client devices. And I forget the number of access points and switches, but it's a lot that you can essentially remotely connect and provision to this Cloud Key Enterprise. So this is designed to essentially be this entire MSP solution in a box. You take the server out, stick it into your racks, they'll give it the data, power redundancy, and internet connectivity, etc. And once that's done, you can remotely provision the client devices. So it is a lot more costly, obviously, because it's Xeon Gold processors, etc. But the benefit is, firstly, it's fully supported by Ubiquiti. It's embedded with the correct software to do this. And I think it's an awesome, I actually think it's a bit of a bargain if you take a look at what you're getting in terms of the hardware specs versus the capabilities of this. So we actually have access to this. We order them in very limited supply, but if you have a requirement for this, please do chat to us. We can absolutely get them. And if you're looking to get more into the MSP style where you're setting up remote provisioning, etc., then this is probably the best way to do it. That pretty much brings us to a close for this. We are going to do a quick Q&A. Sorry, I know it's a little bit brief. We'd love to go into more details in the future, and we will likely set up a more technical webinar in terms of the provisioning and setup in future as well. But I hope this gives you guys a good insight in terms of the advantages of the hosted controller. So yeah, with that, I think let's take a look at the questions. So question here from Sam asking any plans for a webinar on UniFi design. Actually, that's a fantastic idea. Thanks, Sam. That's a great idea. Yeah, let me set that up, schedule that for the next one. I think that's a good idea. Can you share a link to download the controller application? Yep, I can. We can share that off with you. It is also available if you just search for UniFi Controller or UniFi Controller software on Google. That should be pretty much the first link, and it's free of charge to download. Anyone can download it. Yeah, I'll absolutely share that up with you guys as well. There's a comment here from Victor saying, as an MSP, if hosting own cloud controller and own DC, does customer still require, sorry, I'm getting a issue here. Does the customer still require a cloud key to connect to these devices? So cloud key, no. You can essentially, the controller that you're setting up functions as the cloud key. You will still probably need a USG or UXG in order to make the site reachable and in order to have security set up on it. But this essentially takes the place of a Cloud Key Gen 2 Plus or something like that. Then there's a question here from Sean. Can you split the roles? Your server manages their network on their on-site controller for security cameras. I'm not exactly sure what that refers to, Sean, so I'll quickly reach out to you afterwards so we can discuss that in a little bit more details. And then there's a comment here from Menel saying, don't forget you can use AWS and Azure. Yep, absolutely. They become cost effective, especially as you achieve scale and you want to expand more rapidly. Yes, absolutely, that's a good way to do it. Also, please don't run off. We still do have the prize draw left, just as an FYI. Comment here from Glenn, Hostify is a valid option for hosting. Yes, absolutely. And then there's a comment here from Thomas. I recently set up my own hosted virtual server for some clients without local servers. It's disappointing that the mobile app, which shows the new devices in the office you're in and shows the hosted controller, cannot make them adopt it. Yeah, I agree with that. So the Ubiquiti are doing a lot of work to kind of streamline this adoption process when you're using a hosted controller. I'll also just reach out to you directly afterwards, Thomas, to just discuss this a little bit further. Lots of really long questions here, which I'm not sure we can have time to go through all of them. So David, also reach out to you. Slightly off topic, I've been using the edge switch range for layer 3 routing and access to control lists to limit communications with VLAN. Does UniFi switches have the ability yet, and how does UniFi handle routing? So this is the layer 3 routing capabilities, it's a super hot topic within Ubiquiti. There's massive demand for it. Ubiquiti have said that it's coming soon, but they've said that for a while. So I can't comment, unfortunately, on what Ubiquiti is planning with this, but they have said that they are a big focus for them moving forward is layer 3 capabilities. Question here from Jason. I might have missed it, but can you remind us how to add multiple sites to single login? So yes, essentially all that you need to do is you need to enable the multi-site option, and in each one of those sites you have to go add the same user in. I know that's painful, but essentially you have to go keep doing that for every new site. I always say that you typically don't onboard 50 new customers a month, unless you're very fortunate. I hope you do. So it's typically not too much of an admin chore to get that done, but it's still a little bit something to consider. But yeah, essentially you go add an admin per site, and that admin would just be the same account again into each one of them. There is feedback from Ubiquiti saying that they would like to do this in bulk in future, so we'll see if that happens. Good question here from Rob as well. What about the pros and cons with Hostify or Cloud UniFi? So the biggest advantage for me with going with something that Ubiquiti hosts themselves is obviously Ubiquiti has full control over that. I have nothing against Hostify, and I think both are viable options. I think pretty much in terms of the way it's hosted and what's available on both of them, it's pretty much identical. I'll also expand on that later on as well. Good question here. So is the UCK Gen 2 dead and not the Pro? So the general Gen 2, yes. The Gen 2 Plus is still around. Essentially its role has shifted a little bit. Instead of being a device that just does or that functions as a cloud key and a protect device, etc., it's now more focused as a NVR solution. So it's Ubiquiti are kind of phrasing it as an NVR at the moment, and I think that's kind of what they're changing it to be, because it has a 1 terabyte drive and it's cost effective as well. Okay, so there's a ton more questions, so I'm gonna reach out to all of you. I have all of your email addresses after this, so just discuss this individually. With that, I think we can get straight into the prize draw.